different way of doing trainings, but we're in different times. So just so you know, this session is going to be in two parts and it is going to be recorded. So we have started the recording now, and then about halfway through, we'll take a break, and it'll be about a 10-minute break. We'll stop recording and then we'll restart it. And part of the reason we're recording it is because obviously in your department, you're 24/7 operation. So it's difficult to get some of the shift workers into a training during normal business hours. So we're going to record it for purposes of being able for them to see it at some later time. A couple of other preliminary things before I get going here. This is part of the mandatory training required under the Code of Conduct, so you will get credit for it. Rachel will input all of your attendance into my BLC, and so this will cover you for the entire 2-year reporting cycle that we're in the middle of right now. In a few moments, I'm going to bring up the slideshow, so you'll all be able to see that on your screens. When I do that, I don't think I'm going to be able to see any of you all. So if you have questions, you can just unmute your mic and break in. That's absolutely fine. Or if it's more convenient, you can also type questions or comments into the chat room, and Rachel will be monitoring that. And then at the first break, I'll also open it up to see if anybody has any questions or comments, and do so at the very end of the presentation. I know that we're booked for 2 hours this morning. I've been doing it this way for several weeks now, and I'll tell you that they've been running about an hour and a half or so. That's including the break, so we won't go over time, and just so you can plan your day a bit better. One last thing, and then I'll bring up the slideshow. You should have received a copy of the Code of Conduct in your Evite that was sent out to each one of you. We just want to make sure you have a copy of this. Today's presentation, because I'm guessing most of you will have gone through a Code of Conduct training before, this is going to be a little different. And it's going to be different in the sense that I'm not going to talk so much about the code itself, but rather talk about the principles behind it, and also how those principles interact or interplay with our concepts, or my concepts of management and leadership and so forth. And so really this is just more of a meditation about how do we create an ethical culture within the workplace based on the principles contained in the code, but also based upon things that I just think are good basic management leadership principles. And I think we all have a role to play in leadership, especially when it comes to ethics. So with that very long introduction, let me now bring up the PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully you'll all be able to see it on your screens. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. And let me put it into full screen mode for you, maybe you to see it a little bit better. So, you know, the opening slide here is really just a contact information. Our offices are technically in 415 to Harris, although now with most of us working remotely, the best way of contacting us is either through the phone number we give you there. Both Rachel and myself were connected to the VoIP system, the Ring Central system, so those calls go through. And you can always reach us at compliance@burnco.gov. That is a good email address, goes directly into our inbox. And we welcome people to email us with questions, comments, concerns, whatever you may have. So just to kind of get our thinking wrapped around just really basic ideas behind ethical conduct and our ideas about ethics by design, which is sort of what we call the mission of our office. Simple things like saying hello. Even if there's no response to that, it's not really a reason or excuse to stop saying hello. Same for holding the door for other people. I mean, some people don't like to have their doors held for them, but if you do it and they don't do it in return, don't stop holding doors. If you do good for someone and they don't express gratitude, don't stop doing good works. I've got a very good friend of mine who we talk frequently. I've known him for almost 30 years. We're both attorneys. And he sometimes will tell me, well, I sent this email to somebody and they didn't say thank you. And should I take that as an insult? And I said, well, no, not necessarily, but it doesn't mean that you stop doing good things, acknowledging people's work, etc. There are people who are simply not nice sometimes. And even when those people are not nice to us, it's not an excuse or a reason for us to stop acting as a professional, as a person who shows greater responsibility, someone who treats everyone with dignity and respect, even if we're not receiving that same behavior in return. Because if we want to change the world, we have to do that and not let the world change us. And so that is sort of a backdrop or a platform for our office. And our office, as I hope many of you may know, and if you don't, let me tell you, it is a resource for all county employees, elected officials, et cetera, to try to provide a channel of communication on all levels and to try to help resolve issues when we can at the lowest possible level. And keeping in mind that, I'm certainly not the Uber manager. I can't just start coming into a department and disciplining or firing people, but I can at least start the conversation with people when they see things that are going on that they believe are contrary to the county's mission of providing the best service we can to the public that we're intended to serve. So as I mentioned, you received a copy of the Code of Conduct in the Evite for this session. And I just want to give you a little bit of background and reminders about that. The county's Code of Conduct is an ordinance. It is county law. And that places it in somewhat of a unique place, sort of beyond policies or rules or administrative instructions. This is something that was passed by the commission and applies to all county employees, all elected officials, certain classes of volunteers. And what it was born out of is a state law known as the State Governmental Conduct Act, which was amended in 2011 to allow local governments such as the county to adopt their own codes of conduct. And that's what the county commission did, as I indicated. As well, our code of conduct has been ingrained into the urban charter, which was passed a couple of years ago. And so it is very difficult to change. In fact, it requires a supermajority of the commission in order to even amend it. And one of the unique things it did was to create my office, which is the Ethics Compliance Office. And as I mentioned, we are intended in part to be a channel or a hub of communication for people. We provide these trainings and educations, and we also process complaints, which I'll talk about more towards the end. But the idea is my office, if you were to look at the definition of the compliance officer and the description of my office, it is intended to be a neutral, non-biased, nonpartisan resource. In other words, it is separate and apart, let's say, from county legal or HR. The intention behind the creation of my office is how do we get our county as an organization operating in a way that we think is consistent with the values, the principles, the ideas, the morals, if you will, contained within the code. I'm fond of this quotation from JFK when he once said, "There are risks and costs to a program of action, but they are far less than the long-range risks and costs of comfortable inaction." Now, I've been working in local government for the better part of 30 years, and I've noticed in my time working for local governments, both here and in Santa Fe, that there is a tendency of certain government workers to slide into that realm of comfortable inaction. In other words, doing the least amount necessary to just get by. But let me suggest to you that type of an attitude tends to feed those negative stereotypes that the public may have of government workers, not just the county, but at all layers of government. And we all know what those negative stereotypes are. Government workers are lazy, they're incompetent. At a certain level, they may be corrupt. And the typical image that people tend to have of this is the road crew, right? You're driving down the road, you see the road crew, and there's one person digging the hole and three people standing around watching, right? Now, that is a perception that many people in the public may have. Now, it may be an uneducated perception in a sense, because it may be that one of those people standing there is an engineer, one is a safety specialist, one is an equipment specialist, but what does the public see? And I think today, especially, we know that perception can be just as important as reality. And so my point here is that we should strive to do our best to fulfill the county's mission and whatever it is we do, but as well, in those times when we have interactions with the public, we should use that to educate them about our roles, our responsibilities, what we can and what we cannot do, what's within our sphere of influence or within our authority, if you will. And that is a way, I think, of trying to break down those negative perceptions. And I don't think that I can really talk about a lot of these principles without at least making mention of what's going on in the world right now. And it's not just with the pandemic, but also with the elevation in the American conversation and discourse about issues revolving around social injustice and so forth. Right now, I think government workers especially are under a microscope, whether you're in public safety or not, because the public is starting to demand more of us because, as we all know, the county, just like every public agency, is funded through public dollars, through taxpayer dollars. So at the very beginning of the code, there is this description or these principles that talk about responsibility of public office. Now, what I have on this slide here is not from the code, but I think it really condenses the idea behind that section very well. And it says, no matter how educated, talented, rich, or cool you believe you are, how you treat people ultimately tells all. And I think this leads us into this concept of integrity. And what does it mean to fulfill our mission, fulfill our duties on even an individual basis with integrity? And so throughout the rest of this presentation, again, this is going to be a meditation about how do we fulfill these principles or values without going page by page, line by line through the code. So when we talk about responsibility of public office, there are things that I think help us and make us better public servants. And there are also things that can tend to discourage us. So on the left side of the slide there, I talk about things that make us better. And the first being strong and encouraging management. We all want to feel as though we have managers, leaders who have our back, especially when we're trying to do the right thing. And especially when we may be encountering cross pressures from other sources wanting us to do something that's either going to cut corners or violate policy or rules, et cetera. We want the authority and the ability to make decisions within our designated arena. We want to feel as though we're trusted enough to make the calls that we're entitled to make. The third there, I think, is something we want but that we don't always have, and that's the access to the tools, the documentation, just the resources, if you will, to complete our work. And that can be trying sometimes, especially where we may feel like there aren't the financial resources available to us so that we can have access to those tools. But when those things happen, I think it is incumbent upon us to communicate to our leaders at any level that, hey, we're doing the best we can with what we have, but there are other things out there that would help us do things more efficiently. And then clear instruction and justification. And again, I think these are the types of things we would like to see from the people that we're expected to follow. In other words, it's not just enough to set out a goal, but also to give us the steps or the roadmap in terms of how to achieve that goal. And understanding that while everyone is not going to agree with every decision that is made at a management or an upper level, at least have the justification so that if people don't agree, at least they can understand why certain things are being done the way they are. On the other side of the slide is what are those things that tend to discourage us? Having minimal control over our incoming work, or as we may talk about a little bit later on, being micromanaged. None of us like that. None of us like feeling as though everything that we do is either going to be second guessed or there's going to be someone looking over our shoulder all the time. Having a limited choice of tools and processes, as I say, the disconnect between the county and its goals and strategies. In other words, there are often times, whether it be at a department level or an organizational level, we have these strategic plans. But when we start to deviate from those for whatever reason, then we tend to become confused sometimes in terms of, well, what really is the goal here when we do these things that clearly are outside of the strategic plan. And then lastly, very bottom there, one of the most common complaints that I hear from county employees is a lack of a career path or upward mobility. And to be sure, this is something that I have communicated to the county manager, human resources, and I tell them, if you don't give people a career path, if you don't give them the opportunity to grow and expand, not only with regards to salary, but with greater levels of responsibility and so forth, then people will simply take the experience that they gain here and then move on to other organizations. And I think this is particularly important now because I don't know how many have heard these numbers, but the numbers that I've heard indicate that between now and the next 2 or 3 years, up to 50% of the county's workforce is going to become retirement eligible. Now that's a big number. That's up to 1,300 county employees may be retiring between now and say 2024 or so. So it's right now incumbent upon us to be doing that sort of succession planning and to be grooming people to take on greater levels of responsibility and to be identifying the skills that they have and the skills that they may need to cultivate in order to move up into those positions of greater responsibility and leadership. And I keep using that word leadership. Again, my view about this is it doesn't really matter what your title is. We all have a leadership responsibility to play, especially when it comes to these ideas behind ethical cultures. So what makes it a successful organization? Well, I believe the county wants successful people who will support each other, who will build each other up, motivate, inspire, push each other. The challenge for management is how do you change an unsuccessful mindset that simply wants to lay blame or have a negative attitude or complain to that of someone who realizes we will encounter challenges, and especially now within the pandemic and all of the changes we have to our work environments and so forth, that is a challenge for us. And we have to figure out different ways, and we need to have management inspire us to try to figure out different ways of successfully completing our mission. This is a great example here today. 6 months ago, I had very little experience using Teams or how to do trainings remotely, but we've done it. You know, it took some time. It may not be perfect. I can only see one of you on camera right now, and that's okay. But it is a way of moving forward. It is a way still of connecting with people, and hopefully we're going to learn that we can achieve these things in these different environments through technology and just working smarter and not harder. So When we say we're a team, we're not a team because we work together. We're a team because we respect, trust, and care for each other. In fact, there is language at the very beginning of the code that says public servants, and that's all of us, have a duty or an obligation to treat the public and each other with respect, concern, and responsiveness. And as I mentioned in the first slide there, that needs to be our guiding, driving force, even when we're not receiving those same behaviors in return. And that can be very difficult sometimes. I am just as human as the next person. As I say, I've worked in government for almost 30 years now, and not everyone that I've worked for or with are my best friend. They're not all the people that I invite to the family barbecues every year. But nevertheless, even those people who I feel bring a negative attitude and behavior into the workplace, I try to remind myself that many times I have to be the bigger person. I have to be the adult in the room. I have to continue to act as a professional, even if I feel the person that I'm interacting with is acting in a less than professional manner, or in a manner, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, that maybe lacks empathy or emotional intelligence. So here we do have some language that is directly out of the code, and these are the four pillars, I would say, for everything that flows out of the code of conduct. So the very first one talks about this fiduciary duty. In other words, we have certain resources at our disposal that we are intended to use only to advance the public's interest and not for our personal gain or benefit. And this is reflected in things like, how do we award contracts? How do we use county property? It is a common complaint sometimes about people who will call into our office or other offices and say, hey, I saw someone driving a county vehicle and they were either driving or acting inappropriately. That word again, integrity. How do we maintain the integrity and the responsibility of public service? And again, this is for all of us. We all have a huge amount of responsibility, power, authority, no matter what our titles are. How do we use those to the best interests of the public? The third talks about disclosure of real or potential conflicts of interest. And I want to spend just a moment about this, because many times when people see the phrase conflict of interest, they tend immediately think of, oh, that's just about how we award money or contracts or something like that. But let me tell you, there are all sorts of conflicts that can arise in the work that we do. So let me just give you a very simple definition or my concept of what a conflict of interest is. Conflict of interest is whenever our roles as county employees intersect with a role that we have in another part of our lives. So let me give you an example. I was called several years ago from a director who told me that they had just done a hiring panel for interviews for a position in their office. And they said, it turns out that one of the people that they'd placed on the hiring panel was also the fiance of one of the applicants. Now, how it got so far down the road that they didn't disclose or discover that before they went through the interview process, I'm not sure. But they called me, and I think they recognized the problem immediately. Is, you know, here we had, again, a time where someone's personal roles as a fiance was intersecting with their role as a county employee. So my recommendation to them, and they knew this, was to reform the panel, take the fiance off the panel, recall the applicants, re-interview, rescore, and make your decision based upon that. And this relates to, I think, the other 2 points we've already talked about, is how do we maintain the integrity of our decision-making process, whether it be with regards to hiring, awarding of contracts, and the like, and keeping in mind that many times when we have an unsuccessful applicant or bidder for a contract, what we do is subject to public scrutiny. And so they may do a records request, wanting to see the credentials, wanting to see the bid packet of the successful bidder or applicant, looking for something that would call into question the integrity of that that decision-making process. And then finally, the bottom there, it talks about not getting anything additional money or anything of value just for doing our jobs. This relates to the gift rule, which is contained within the code. If I have time, I'll talk a bit about that towards the end. But the idea here is we should not be perceived as expecting something in addition to our salaries just for doing our jobs. And we need to be very cautious about that, especially when dealing not only, say, with contractors or vendors, but also with any member of the public who is relying upon us for performance of our duties or some decision making, et cetera. So that's why we have these limitations on the gifts that say lobbyists or vendors or people seeking permits or developers. We have these limits to try to negate or deflect the perception that people in a decision-making role may be on the take. So let's move into this idea of character. And I think character is something that we can apply not only to ourselves and others on an individual basis, but also to organizations as a whole. So the top there, character, this is sort of an old saying, character is what we do when no one is watching. And we could replace the word character with ethics, values, principles, whatever. And in fact, I think we could almost turn it on its head a bit and say in the modern era, character is what we do because everyone is watching. And that is becoming more and more true today, especially whether or not we work in an environment where there may be cameras or anything like that. People may be recording us even if we don't know it. I was particularly struck when, even now, as you see the protests that are continuing to go on in this country and other parts of the world, so many people who are participating in those protests have their cell phones out and are recording everything that's being done. And if you drive a county vehicle, or if you wear a county logo or insignia on your shirts, then you are subject to people recording your actions, whether it be by their cell phone or just what they observe and then emailing us. So we have to operate as though we are being taped all the time, whether or not that's true or not, because our behavior, our decisions, what other people learn about us, and is what we learn about ourselves. And what we want to avoid are those instances when the things that we say confront or conflict what we do. An example, just recently, I don't know how many of you saw this, it was a few weeks ago in the news, where the Speaker of the House of the Ohio legislature is now under a federal indictment for a $60 million fraud scheme. And I point that out because that just happened now. And you think about it and you think that is precisely the type of story that feeds those negative stereotypes in the public's mind. Because I'm fairly certain that when this person was elected, he ran on a platform of, oh, you can trust me, I will become a good public steward, et cetera, and then this happens. And the public becomes skeptical, or they tend not to trust government because one bad actor like that can impact a person or the public's perception of government at all different levels. The character is the, I believe, most accurate reflection of our true motivations, and so this matters. If you have children, for example, how do you measure or evaluate their character? My guess is it's by their behavior. It's what they do. And if even when they deny these things, it's what they do that tends to be what we think of as their true character because of their actions, their decisions, etc. So work ethic. Let me spend just a moment on this. And it is in this sort of scenario that I put up on the slide where you have someone who is applying for a job or an internship, and the question is put to them, why should we hire you? Typical question, heard in virtually every interview that I've been a part of, whether it be, why should we hire you? Why do you want to work here? Why do you think you're the best candidate for the position? Very, very typical. And here was the response that we found in this one example. It said, my dad once told me I would never be the strongest person. I would never be the fastest person. I would probably not be the tallest person, but I could outwork them all. I may not have more credentials than your other candidates, but I will outwork them all. And I think that is an expression of a work ethic that we all can value, because none of us are perfect people, especially when we start out in our careers. But what we're looking for are those individuals who are willing to put in the time, to pay their dues, to outwork everybody else, and to grow and expand their skill set. So, for example, one of the things that I see that I think is reflective of this attitude is in my career when I've handed someone an assignment and they say, well, I've never done that before, but I'm willing to learn, as opposed to saying, I don't know how to do that, so I can't do that. That is someone who indicates to me they're really not willing to grow or incorporate or become a part of the organization to try to work towards fulfilling the greater mission. And in fact, I can attest to the fact that I've interviewed people where, and this, I recall one time in particular interviewing someone for an internship, and in the interview, they had a list of all the things that they would not do. And it sort of struck me as well, if you're basically dictating what you think the job should be rather than listening to what the job is, you're probably not going to have the right chemistry for this position. So expanding this idea of organizational character ethics, this is where we apply the concept of the standards and the expectations of behavior, which we can find in the code, while representing and working for the organization. And this is distinct from anyone's individual personal ethics. So let me give you an example of something that I have heard of recently that can be reflective of an organization's character or ethics. I've been following some stories and podcasts recently dealing with the economic impact that the pandemic has had, especially on employment. And you've all seen the employment numbers recently, I'm sure. And one of the podcasts I was listening to, it started out with the story of this woman who said that she was working, I think she was working remotely, and she received an email, as several people did in her group, that said, okay, everyone needs to log in on this conference call on this date at this time, mandatory, everyone needs to be there. They all do. When they're all logged in, a manager gets online and reads a 3-minute script. And at the end of that 3-minute script, he says, now everyone on this conference call has been let go. Okay, I'm not going to dispute or argue with whether or not, because of their financial circumstances, the organization needed to let those people go. What I am going to take into question is the way they went about it. In other words, when you're delivering news like that, especially news that deals with a person's livelihood, I think it is incumbent upon organizations to do it in a way that still has empathy for the person and the emotions that they will likely feel when they receive that news, and a certain amount of humanity. I'm not saying that what they did was wrong legally. I just think that it is reflective of the organization's character in a way that might cause people, not only those who were let go, but the people who were not let go, because everyone's going to know it happened, to question the character of that organization and their decision making. So ethical standards in the workplace drive our current performance, but they also tend to set the standard and the bar for future generations. And that's why I think it's something that we should pay attention to as a part of our usual routine. Because when we reflect the highest ethical standards in the workplace to those around us, then other people see that and they tend to incorporate it into their work as well. And we need to define those areas of respect, confidence, integrity, trust, moral character, if you will, and display them all the time. And this is the distinction I'm trying to make here. There is a distinction between simply following the rules, the policy, the law, and then acting in a manner that justifies all of those things that I just listed. They can require us to go beyond just the written instructions, rules, regulations, etc. So when I talk about ethics in the workplace, I am, as I've mentioned, I think talking about behavioral ethics. In other words, what are those behaviors that promote human welfare? And certainly in you all's work at behavioral health, you are dealing on a daily basis with human welfare, with the welfare of those clients, people who come to your facility, et cetera. And so these are the standards of behavior that guide us and instruct us as to how we should be conducting our lives. And the code exists to apply to all of us to try to create a consistency of behavior that incorporates all of these principles I've been talking about. So applying it in a governmental context, it means what are we doing as part of a county government that is promoting human welfare and advancing the county's mission. And these are things that we can reflect upon for a long time. And as I say, I hope this stuff isn't too high-minded or anything like that, but I really wanted to get away from just talking about the different sections of the code and talking about how does this really get implemented in our day-to-day routines. And I think this stuff is important because it creates these shared values that teach us how to act within the workplace and make collaboration and cooperation possible, and hopefully are going to lead to us feeling better about what we do and that we are valued and that we are adding value to the county as an organization as a whole. As well, I mentioned, we're going to have a tremendous amount of change happening in the next few years. So what are we doing for future generations within the workplace? For the new people who are going to be coming in now, observing our behaviors, what are we doing to try to set the bar for them on a behavioral level to the highest degree possible? And then you can see there, this, in my view, is important not only because it makes us feel better about what we're doing, but it has this sort of infectious appeal, if you will, so that other people will be incorporating these same types of behavior. Because I can pass out all these codes and I can do all these trainings, but at the end of the day, the things that tend to drive behavior in a workplace, and I'm not talking just about the county, but any place, is what do managers do? What do they tell their people to do? How do they tell the people to do it? And what are the people around us doing? Because if I see somebody doing something in the workplace and they're not getting in trouble, then I'm going to automatically assume that I can do that as well. It is these observed behaviors that people tend to incorporate. So talking so much about what ethics is, I don't think it is about other things. I think it is about behavior, but I don't think it's about just, things like our self-esteem or whether we can do something and just get away with it. I don't think it's about just following the law. I think the law, the code, these are good platforms for our behavior, but they aren't the end of it, because we can't have a rule or an instruction for everything that we do. So sometimes our behavior has to be occupying that space that goes beyond what's written down. In other words, we have to do these things because we are aware of the perceptions that they may create or the precedent that they may create. And when we do these things again, this is promoting human welfare. It encourages us to be the type of people, be the type of representatives of the county that we want to be and that we want others to be. And hopefully, and maybe this is aspirational, but hopefully it makes there to be a greater sense of fulfillment for people, making them feel good about what they do and happier about their choices. So, as I've said throughout this first part, we all have a role in guiding ethics. And so on this slide, I contrast two different concepts, one of leadership and one of brinksmanship. Leadership, in my view, is the art of motivating people to act towards achieving a common goal. Brinksmanship, on the other hand, is the art of pushing confrontation to the limit of safety to force a desired outcome. We could use other words there, words that we're perhaps more familiar with, like bullying or aggression. So many times I see people who are promoted into positions of leadership or leadership roles, and they may have very high technical skills within whatever area it is, but they don't have necessarily all of the management skills. And because of that, it tends to make them become overly aggressive or insecure, and in their insecurity, they will try to just bully or shout people down just to get their way. But I think we can recognize that leadership in the description here is persuasive. The other is coercive. I'm doing this just because I'm being beaten down or because I'm forced to do it without any clear direction or justification. Leadership feels like success. Brinksmanship just feels like oppression or failure. In other words, those people who, again, automatically respond to a situation, it may not even be a conflict situation. It may just be they don't know necessarily how to get people to follow them because of, again, trust, respect, professionalism, what have you. They simply feel they have the title, they have authority, and that gives them the ability to basically bully or boss people around, and that is all that is required of them as a manager. So when we create an ethical culture, there are some very simple things that we can do. So at the top here, and I've used these in other presentations, I talk about commitment, doing what you say. This is one of the things that frustrates me the most at the county, is people who will say they will do something and simply not follow through. And not only that, they won't communicate to me as to why they're not following through, whether or not there have been some impediments or roadblocks that have gotten in their way. They simply stay silent, and I'm left to think, well, how can I ever trust or rely on this person again? Morally courageous leaders. I tell managers, directors, DCMs, elected officials, it starts with you. You set the bar, you set the standard of behavior that the people around you will follow. And this comes out, as we've talked about, not only in our interactions with the public, but our interactions with each other. Are we doing the most that we can to treat each other with respect and dignity? Because I do believe that each one of us as an individual is reflective of the county's reputation as a whole. And the bottom part here I found fascinating. And this was based on some research about simple thank yous and how a thank you can actually sometimes be more important than money. So this is based on some research that was done by a Harvard professor named Ashley Willens. And what he found was that in a tight labor market like ours currently, one of the things that organizations may do to try to keep people, if they're able, is to give them salary bonuses or bumps and something like that. But what Willens' research suggests is that cash, yeah, it's important, no doubt about that, but it's not the end all and be all. More than anything, Willens found that employees want to feel recognized and valued for their work. And 80% of the workers that they surveyed claim they don't receive such praise. So in other words, non-cash rewards like flexible work options help, but a simple, earnest thank you goes much further than many managers realize. And this is something I try to remind myself of all the time, is when someone does something for me at work, even if it's routine, even if it's a part of their duties and responsibilities, I try to remember to thank them, whether it's a simple email, or sometimes I'll just, especially when I feel like they've sort of gone above and beyond or gotten to something right away from me, I'll just call up and say, hey, I really appreciate what you've done. Thank you. Because I try to remember we all want to feel valued. That's a very basic human desire. And we want to feel as though we are adding value to the county. So this is the last slide before the break. I think the things that guide our behaviors, we've talked some about laws, rules, regulations, codes, policies, etc. But these things, again, these provide us with a platform or a floor for our behavior. True ethical conduct, in my view, is all that space above. It's all that atmosphere that goes beyond the written rules and really gets to the heart of how are we doing things in a professional manner that, subject to public scrutiny, we can be proud of and that the public can feel good about with regards to how we have used county resources. So I do believe, yes, that is the end of part one. So let me take it off of share screen just for a moment here. I can find my tray. And so off of share screen, I'll bring my camera back up, or I guess it was always on, and just say we're about to take a break here, but are there any questions, comments people have about what I've said so far? I feel like I'm going quickly, but hopefully you're finding some value in some of the things that I'm talking about. See a few nodding of heads, so that's good. But anything anyone wants to add at this point? I'm seeing shaking of heads. So I guess we're all ready for a break here. So I've got it exactly at 9:50. So why don't we take a 10-minute break? As I say, we'll stop the recording now and then come back at 10 o'clock and do the second half. Okay, sound good?